Today we are going to discuss chapter number 24. In this particular chapter, we will be focusing on the effectiveness of monetary as well as fiscal policy in the Islm framework. As you know that since World War II, government policy makers have tried to promote high employment without causing inflation. If the economy experiences a recession, such as the one that began in March 2001, policymakers have two principal set of tools that can be used to affect aggregate economic activity. Number one, monetary policy. This is the first tool for the economist to apply to affect the aggregate level of output. In the monetary policy, they are trying to control the interest rates or the money supply. So, in the monetary policy, the policy makers have two instruments or two policy steps. Number one, changing in the interest rate. Number second, changing in the money supply. And the second important set of tool is known as the fiscal policy. And in the fiscal policy, the government is controlling its expenditures and taxes. It means that under the fiscal policy, the government have two options. Number one, bringing changes in government expenditures. Number second, change in the tax rate. The Islm model can help policymakers predict what will happen to aggregate level of output and interest rates if they decide to increase the money supply or increase government spending. It means that the policymakers are the monetary economists predict what will happen to aggregate level of output and the equilibrium interest rate if they decide to increase the money supply by using the monetary policy or increase government spending by using the fiscal policy. It means what will happen to the aggregate level of output or the equilibrium interest rate if the policy makers bring changes in monetary policy and fiscal policy. It means that the ISLM analysis enable us to answer some important questions about the usefulness and effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy influencing the aggregate economic activity. But the question is, which policy is better, the monetary policy or the fiscal policy? Number second important question is, when is monetary policy more effective than fiscal policy at controlling the level of aggregate output? And when it is less effective? Number third important question is, will fiscal policy be more effective if it is conducted by changing government spending rather than changing taxes? Which tool or which instrument or which option is more effective when the government is entrusted to use the fiscal policy? That's why we are interested to know that will fiscal policy be more effective if it is conducted by changing government spending rather than changing taxes? The next important question is, should the monetary authorities conduct monetary policy by manipulating the money supply or interest rates? So in this particular chapter, we use the ISLM model to help answer these questions and to learn how the model generates the aggregate demand curve, featured prominently in the aggregate demand and supply framework, which is used to understand changes not only in aggregate output but in the price level as well. Let me start my discussion from the first topic. The title of this topic is Factors that Cause the IS Curve to Shift or Shift in the IS Curve. It means that what are the factors causing shift in the IS curve? In the last lecture, we have discussed that the I-S curve describes equilibrium points in the goods market. It means the combination of aggregate output and interest rate for which aggregate output produce equals aggregate demand. The I-S curve shifts whenever a change in autonomous factors occur that is unrelated to the interest rate. What are the factors that cause the I-S curve to shift from its original position to a new position? Very simply, the I-S curve shifts whenever a change in autonomous factors occur that is unrelated to the interest rate. It means that there are certain factors that are unrelated to the interest rate. They have no relationship with the interest rate. If there is a change in one of these factors, it means the I-S curve will shift from its original position to a new equilibrium, to a new position, but the interest rate will remain the same and the level of output will change. Why we are saying that the interest rate is constant? Actually, a change in the interest rate that affects equilibrium aggregate level of output causes a movement along the I-S curve. We have two kinds of changes. One is known as movement along the I-S curve or movement along the Islm curve. And the second change is known as shift, where the I-S curve or the Islm curve completely changes its position, where the I-S curve completely shifts from its original position to a new position, and same is the case with the Islm curve. When we discuss about the case of shift, it means that the I-S curve or the Islm curve will completely shift its position from the original to a new position. But when we talk about moment, it means changing positions from one point to another along the same I-S curve or along the same LM curve. There are five factors, or there are five candidates as autonomous factors that can shift aggregate demand and hence affect the level of equilibrium output. Number one, changes in autonomous consumer expenditure. This is the first important factor which causes shift in the I-S curve. A rise in autonomous consumer expenditure shifts aggregate demand upward. If there is a change or if there is a rise in autonomous consumer expenditure, you know that this change will shift the aggregate demand curve upward from its original position and shifts the I-S curve to the right. It means that if there is a rise in autonomous consumer expenditure, the aggregate demand curve will shift upward, and in a result, it will shift the I-S curve to the right position. Look at this diagram. For example, the I-S curve is initially at IS1 in panel A. This is panel A. In the panel A, the I-S curve is initially at IS1. IS1 is the original I-S curve. And suppose a huge oil field is discovered in Wyoming, which is a state in the United States, perhaps containing more oil than in Saudi Arabia. So consumers now become more optimistic about the future health of the economy, and autonomous consumer expenditure rises. So what will happen? What happens to the equilibrium level of aggregate output as a result of this rise in autonomous consumer expenditure when the interest rate is held constant? You can see that IA, which is the interest rate, this is constant, and I is 1 is the original IS curve, and at this curve we have point A, where YA denotes the aggregate level of output. This is the initial aggregate level of output. The IS curve tells us that equilibrium aggregate output is at YA when the interest rate is IA, and we have the point A on the IS curve. Look at panel B. This is panel B. This panel B or this graph shows the effect on goods market equilibrium when the interest rate is IA. This panel shows that at this point is an equilibrium in the goods market because the aggregate demand function Y1AD at an interest rate IA crosses the 45 line at an aggregate output level YA. So look at this one. This is Y1AD, which is the aggregate demand curve, and this aggregate demand curve touches or crosses the aggregate output curve at point A. This is the 45-degree line, the black curve. And here, as you know that Y is equal to YAD, we can show this A point on the aggregate demand and aggregate output curve here. This is the crossing point where we have YA level of aggregate output. When autonomous consumer expenditure rises because of the oil discovery in Wyoming, so the aggregate demand function shifts upward to Y2AD. Look at this is due to the increase in autonomous consumer expenditures. This will shift the Y1AD curve from its original position to Y2AD. And now we have the equilibrium level of output at YA dash. This is the new equilibrium level of output, and this is the new equilibrium point where Y2AD is equal to Y at point A dash, and we have YA dash, the aggregate level of output. The rise in equilibrium output from YA to YA dash when the interest rate A is plotted in panel A. Look it. There is a change. We have plotted this change here in panel A. This is the original position, original point, point A, and this is the new point on the new IS curve, which is IS2. And we have YA dash, the new level of aggregate output, and we have the fixed interest rate. It means that we have a moment from point A to point A dash. The same analysis can be applied to every point on the initial IS curve. Therefore, a rise in autonomous expenditure shift the IS curve to the right from IS1 to IS2. So this is the first and most important factor. It means that if there is a change in autonomous consumer expenditure, and if the autonomous consumer expenditure rises, it means the IS curve will shift towards the right position from IS1 to IS2. And similarly, if there is a decline in autonomous consumer expenditures, so the direction of the change will be reverse. So for any given interest rate, the aggregate demand function shifts downward and the equilibrium level of output falls and the IS curve shifts from the original position to the left. Okay, this was the first important factor, that if changes in autonomous consumer expenditures increases, it will shift the IS curve from the original position to the right side. The second important factor which shifts the IS curve from its original position is known as changes in investment spending unrelated to the interest rate. Therefore, changes in investment spending unrelated to the interest rate is the most and second important factor shifting the IS curve. As you know that changes in the interest rate affect planned investment spending and hence the equilibrium level of output. But this change in investment spending merely causes a moment along the IS curve and not a shift. A rise in planned investment spending unrelated to the interest rate. For example, because companies become more confident about investment profitability after the Wyoming price discovery, so shifts the aggregate demand function upward. If the particular companies become more confident about the investment profitability, because as the companies know that we the government or the particular city have discovered oil reserves, what they will do, they will change investment because they are now more confident about the investment profitability after the oil discovery. What will be the result? It means the aggregate demand function goes to a new position from the original. If suppose y1ad is the original aggregate demand function, then this original position will change to y2ad. Why this curve is shifting from its position? Because as you know that aggregate demand is consist of four main components. Number one, consumption expenditures. Number two, investment expenditures. Number three, government spending. Number four, net exports. It means that if the planned investment expenditure rises, I mean to say that changes in investment spending from I1 to I2. It means in the case of increase in planned investment expenditures, we have more aggregate output and the aggregate demand curve will shift from its original position. And you can see the same change in this panel B where Y1AD changes to Y2AD. Why? Because of more planned investment expenditures. So for any given interest rate, the equilibrium level of aggregate output rises and the I-S curve will shift to the right. What will be the result? The I-S curve will shift to the right from IS1 to IS2. But if a decrease in investment spending occurs because companies become more pessimistic about investment profitability, shifts the aggregate demand function downward for any given interest rate. The equilibrium level of aggregate output falls, shifting the I-S curve to the left. It means if we have the reverse case, I mean to say if there is a decrease in investment spending, what will be the result? Actually, a decrease in investment spending because companies become more pessimistic about investment profitability shift the aggregate demand curve downward for any given interest rate. If the aggregate demand function shifts downward, it means the equilibrium level of output falls and it will shift the I-S curve from the original position to the left side. For example, if we say that I-2 is the original I-S curve, in the case of decrease in planned investment expenditures, the I-S curve will shift from I-2 to I-1. So this is the result. This was the second important factor. Let me discuss the third important factor, changes in government spending. Changes in government spending is the third most important factor shifting the I-S curve. Suppose an increase in government spending will also cause the aggregate demand function at any given interest rate to shift upward. It means that if there is an increase in government expenditures, the aggregate demand function at any given interest rate will shift upward. For example, if Y1AD is the original aggregate demand function, and if the government increases its expenditures, it means Y1AD will shift to Y2AD because of the increase in government expenditures. So what is the result? It means we have more level up aggregate output because of this increase in government expenditures. The equilibrium level of output rises at any given level of interest rate, and the I-square shifts to the right from the original position. So if there is an increase in government expenditures, it means Y1 AD will change to Y2 AD, and we have more level of aggregate output from Y1 to YA dash. YA dash is the new equilibrium level of output. And what is the result? It means the I curve will shift from its original position to the new. Or we can say that the I curve will shift from I is 1 to I is 2. Suppose if we have the inverse case, I mean to say if the government expenditures decrease, what will be the result? How this decrease in government spendings will shift the IS curve? So very simply, a decline in government spending shifts the aggregate demand function downward, and the equilibrium level of output falls, shifting the IS curve to the left side. Suppose if Y2AD is the original aggregate demand function, and now if there is a decrease in government spendings, it means the aggregate demand Y2AD will shift its position to Y1AD, a downward shift. It means we have a decrease in aggregate level of output, and the I curve will shift towards the left side. Let me discuss about the fourth important factor causing a shift in the IS curve, and that is known as changes in taxes. Changes in taxes is the fourth important factor shifting the IS curve. In the first three cases where we have discussed the three factors, number one, changes in autonomous consumer expenditures, changes in investment spending unrelated to the interest rate, and changes in government spending. Changes in these three factors directly affect the aggregate demand function. I mean to say that if there is an increase in autonomous consumer expenditures, and if there is an increase in investment spending, and if there is an increase in government spending, it will directly affect the aggregate demand function. It means from Y1 to Y2 AD, because a change in any of these factors or a change in all these factors directly affect the aggregate demand curve. But when we talk about changes in taxes, a decline in taxes shifts the aggregate demand function by raising consumer expenditure and shifting the aggregate demand function upward at any given interest rate. But we are talking about a decrease in taxes. If we talk about an increase in government taxes, it means this factor have a negative influence on the aggregate demand curve. For example, if a decline in taxes raises the aggregate level of the equilibrium level of aggregate output at any given interest rate and shifts the IS curve to the right. But if there is a decrease in the tax rate, if there is a decrease in the tax rate, the IS curve will shift to the right side from IS1 to IS2 curve. However, a change in taxes has a smaller effect on aggregate demand than an equivalent change in government spending. So for a given change in taxes, the IS curve will shift less than for an equal change in government spending. But if there is a rise in the government tax rate, what will happen? A rise in taxes lowers the aggregate demand function and reduces the equilibrium level of aggregate output at any interest rate. Therefore, a rise in taxes shifts the IS curve to the left side from the original position. It means that if there is a rise in the tax rate, it means Y2 AD will shift towards Y1 AD. It means that the aggregate level of output will decrease from YA dash to YA, and therefore the I is curve will shift from I is 2 to I is 1 to the left side. That's why we can say that if there is a rise in taxes, it will lower the aggregate demand function and hence reduces the equilibrium level of output at any interest rate. Hence, we can say that a rise in taxes shifts the IS curve to the left side from the original position. Now, I am going to talk about the fifth and final factor, which is known as changes in net exports unrelated to the interest rate. Actually, we are talking about unrelated to the interest rate because they have no relationship with the interest rate. Therefore, the level of interest rate is constant. You can see from here. In each case, IA remains constant. There is no change in the level of interest rate. We have kept this level of interest rate constant. That's why we are saying that changes in net exports unrelated to the interest rate. As you know that the level of interest rate have a relationship with the net exports, and similarly the level of interest rate has a relationship with the uh, planned investment spendings. Okay, the fifth important factor is changes in net exports unrelated to the interest rate. So as with the planned investment spending, changes in net exports arises from a change in interest rates merely cause a moment along the IS curve and not a shift. It means that if there is a change in the interest rate, there will be a moment along the IS curve, maybe from point A to point B. If the interest rate decreases from IA to suppose IA dash, we will move from point A to point A dash. This is known as moment along the IS curve. But when the interest rate is fixed, when the interest rate is constant, it means we have shifted the IS curve will completely shift from its original position. An autonomous rise in net exports unrelated to the interest rate. For example, because American made jeans become more fashionable than French made jeans. For example, the American economy is producing jeans, and these produced jeans are more fashionable than those jeans produced by France. Hence, shift the aggregate demand function upward. What will be the result? The aggregate demand function will shift upward and causes the IS curve to shift to the right side from the original position. So it means the IS curve will shift from IS1 to IS2. And YAD, why? Because YAD1 is changing its position to Y2 AD. If the aggregate demand function shifts upward, it means the IS curve will shift to the right side, but this is the case here. But if we make the case reverse, I mean to say if there is a decrease in net exports unrelated to the interest rate, what will be the result? So conversely, an autonomous fall in net exports shifts the aggregate demand function downward and the equilibrium level of output falls, shifting the IS curve to the left side. So in this case, then the IS curve will shift to the left side. For example, from IS2 to IS1. Anyhow, these were five important factors shifting the IS curve. Now, Let me talk about those factors that change the LM curve to shift. As you know that the LM curve describes the equilibrium points in the market for money. I mean to say that the combinations of aggregate output at the interest rate for which the quantity of money demanded equals the quantity of money supplied. So as you know that when we talk about the LM curve, LM curve actually represents the equilibrium position where the interest rate and aggregate level of output are in equilibrium, and we can say that the demand for money is equal to the supply of money. In the previous case, we have discussed five important factors that shifts the I-curve from its original position. But now, in this case, we have only two factors that can cause the LM curve to shift. There are two factors due to which the LM curve will shift. Number one, autonomous changes in money demand. Number second, changes in the money supply. These are the two factors due to which a change in the LM curve occurs. Let me explain each factor one by one. Number one, changes in the money supply. For example, if there is a change in the money supply, how this change in the money supply will shift the LM curve to which position? If there is a rise in the money supply, I mean to say that if there is an increase in the money supply, so a rise in the money supply shifts the LM curve to the right side. Look at here, shift the LM curve from LM1 to LM2. Suppose we have the original LM curve at LM1. LM1 is the original LM curve, and the Federal Reserve conducts open market purchases that increase the money supply. For example, the Federal Reserve conducts open market purchases that increase the money supply. If we consider point A, which is on the original LM1 curve, we can examine what happens to the equilibrium level of interest rate holding output constant at YA. This is the original point on the initial LM curve where we have IA level of interest rate and YA level of aggregate output. Now look at panel B. Panel B, which contains a supply and demand diagram for the market for money. We have the money demand when we have YA level of output, and we have money supply MS1 and MS2. So panel B contains a supply and demand diagram for the market for money, which depicts the equilibrium interest rate initially as IA. This is the original uh, level of interest rate IA at the intersection of the supply curve for money M1 is and the demand curve for the money MD. This is M1 is the original demand, original money supply curve, and MDYA is the original money demand function. And MDYA intersects M1 is at point A, where we have IA level of interest rate and M1 peak level of quantity of real money balance. Now, the rise in the quantity of money supplied shifts the LM curve to M2, MS2. If there is a rise in the money supply, the curve will shift from M1S to M2MS2, holding output constant at YA. Here we have A is constant, but the equilibrium interest rate falls to IA dash from IA to IA dash. This decline in the equilibrium interest rate from IA to IA dash is shown by a moment from point A to point A dash. Look at here, from point A to point A dash. And now we have a decrease in the interest rate. And the same analysis can be applied to every point on the initial LM curve, leading to the conclusion that any given level of aggregate output, the equilibrium interest rate falls when the money supply increases. Because we have the fixed level of aggregate output, and when there is an increase in the money supply, it means the interest rate will decrease, and we are moving from point A to point A dash. Thus, LM2 is below and to the right of LM1. Reversing this reasoning, a decline in the money supply. Suppose this was the case when the money supply increased, but when the money supply decreases, what will happen? A decline in the money supply shifts the LM curve to the left. A decline in the money supply results in a shortage of money at points on the initial LM curve. This condition of excess demand for money can be eliminated by a rise in the interest rate. So in this case, the interest rate will rise, which reduces the quantity of money demanded until it again equals the quantity of money supplied. So in this case, the interest rate will rise. Now, we have the second important factor, which is known as the autonomous changes in money demand. That how autonomous changes in money demand changes the original position of the LM curve. For example, the theory of asset demand indicates that there can be an autonomous rise in money demand. For example, an increase in the volatility of bond returns would make bonds riskier relative to money and would increase the quantity of money demanded at any given interest rate, price level, or autonomous aggregate output. The resulting autonomous increase in the demand for money shifts the I-curve to the left. Suppose we are at point A on the initial LM curve LM1. Suppose that a massive financial panic occurs, sending many companies into bankruptcy. Because bonds have become a riskier asset, people want to shift from holding bonds to hold money. They will hold more money at all interest rates and output levels. The resulting increase in money demand at an output level of YA is shown by a shift in the money demand curve from MD1 to MD2. The new equilibrium in the market for money now indicates that if the aggregate output is constant at YA, the equilibrium interest rate will rise from IA to IA dash, and the equilibrium point moves from point A to point A dash. It means that the LM curve shifts to the right from LM1 to LM2 when the money supply increases, and the LM curve shifts to the left from LM1 to LM2 when money demand increases. So these are the two important factors causing shift in the LM curve. Now we are going to talk about the changes in equilibrium level of the interest rate and aggregate output. So response to a change in monetary policy. Actually, when we are talking about the changes in monetary policy, it means we are talking about changes in the money supply, especially changes in the money demand or changes in the money supply. But when we are talking about the fiscal policy, changes in the fiscal policy, actually we are talking about changes in government spending and changes in government taxes. Response to a change in monetary policy. It means that if there is a change in monetary policy, how the economy will respond. Suppose we are talking about an increase in the money supply. If the money supply has increased in the economy, what will happen to the level of aggregate output as well as the interest rate. Suppose the economy is in equilibrium for both the goods market and the money market at point 1. So this is point 1 where IS1 touches LM1, and at point 1 we have I1 level of interest rate and Y1 level of aggregate output. So we can say that the economy is in equilibrium at point 1 where IS1 touches LM1. Now suppose that at the resulting level of aggregate output Y1, the economy is suffering from an unemployment rate of 10%. For example, if we say that, okay, we are here at equilibrium level of output, which is Y1, and at this level of output, the particular economy is suffering from an unemployment rate of 10%. It means that 10% of the people or 10% of the US citizens are unemployed when we are here at point Y1. And the Federal Reserve decides it should try to raise output and reduce unemployment. So, this is the objective of the Federal Reserve to increase the level of aggregate output and to decrease the level of or the percentage of unemployed people. So, if this is the agenda of the Federal Reserve, what will be the policy? Will the Federal Reserve change in monetary policy have the intended effect? Suppose the rise in the money supply causes the LM curve to shift rightward to LM2. Originally, we are here at point 1 where IS1 is equal to LM1, but now there is a rise in the money supply by the Federal Reserves. So, in the result, LM1 will shift to LM2, and the equilibrium point for both the goods market and the money market moves to point B. Then we will come from point A to point B, and sorry, point 2. At point 2 we have the new interest rate, which is I2, and we have the new level of aggregate output, which is Y2. So at point 2 the original IS curve touches the new LM curve, which is LM2. As a result of an increase in money supply, the interest rate declines. Look at from I1 to I2, the interest rate decreases and the aggregate output rises to Y2. From Y1 to Y2, the federal policy has been successful in improving the health of the economy. It means now the Federal Reserve policy has been successful in improving the health of the economy. How? Look at it has increased the aggregate level of output, but now we have a decrease in the interest rate. The question is that why aggregate output rises and the interest rate declines? As we can see that the aggregate output rises and the interest rate decreases. Why? Because we have moved from point 1 to point 2 in the case when there is an increase in money supply. Actually, when the economy is at point 1, the increase in the money supply creates an excess supply of money because the Federal Reserve has increased the money supply. It means that now we have an excess supply of money, resulting in a decline in the interest rate. The decline causes investment spending and net exports to rise because we have now excess supply of money. It means that we have an excess supply of money in circulation, so the interest rate will decrease. If the interest rate decreases, it means the decline causes investment spending and net exports to rise. If the level of interest rate decreases, it means the level of investment spending increases. And similarly, the level of net exports to rise. As in the previous chapter, we discussed the case that there is a negative relationship between the interest rate and the investment spending. And similarly, there is a negative relationship between the interest rate and net exports. That's why we can say that the investment spending and net exports will decrease, which in turn raises aggregate demand. It means that now we have an increase in the aggregate demand, or we can say that the Y1 AD will shift to Y2 AD. Why? Because now we have more investment spending and we have more net exports. If we have more investment spending and net exports, it means that the aggregate demand curve will shift and the aggregate level of output will rise. So the excess supply of money is eliminated when the economy reaches point 2, because initially with the increase in the money supply we have an excess supply of money, and that excess supply of money has been eliminated when the economy reaches to point 2 from point 1, because both the rise in output and the fall in interest rate have raised the quantity of money demanded until it equals the new higher level of money supply. Now, if we talk about a decrease in the money supply, what will happen? So, a decline in the money supply reverses the process. It means we have the reverse effect when the money supply decreases. It shifts the Islm curve to the left. So actually here in the first case we talked about the increase in money supply. But if we make reverse this case, I mean to say that if the money supply decreases, what will happen? The Islm curve will shift to the left side from the original position, causing the interest rate to rise and output to fall. So the result will be reverse. The interest rate will rise and the output level will fall. So we can say that aggregate output is positively related to the money supply. Actually, this is the conclusion, that aggregate output is positively related to the money supply. It means that aggregate output expands when the money supply increases, and the aggregate output falls when the money supply decreases. It means that there is a direct relationship between the aggregate output and the money supply, as you can see from the graphical plot as well. When there is an increase in the money supply, the Islm curve will shift to the right side. It means the interest rate will decrease and the aggregate output will increase. But if we talk about the reverse case, I mean to say that if there is a decrease in money supply, the interest rate will rise. The interest rate will rise and the Islm curve will shift to the left side. Hence, there will be a decrease in the aggregate output level. That's why we can say that aggregate output is positively related to the money supply. Now, let me talk about response to a change in fiscal policy. In the previous case, we talked about response to a change in monetary policy. But now we are talking about response to a change in fiscal policy. Suppose the Federal Reserve is not willing to increase the money supply when the economy is suffering from a 10% unemployment rate at point 1. In the previous case, we talked about that Y1 is the aggregate level of output and the economy is at equilibrium position at point 1, where we have I1 interest rate and Y1 level of aggregate output, and I curve touches the Islm curve at point 1. Now we are talking about that the Federal Reserve is not willing to increase the money supply when the economy is suffering from a 10% level of 10% unemployment rate. For example, if at point 1 where the economy is producing at Y1 and the economy is suffering at 10% unemployment rate, if the government is not willing to increase the money supply to decrease the unemployment rate. So the question is, Can the federal government come to rescue and manipulate government expenditure and taxes to raise the aggregate output and reduce the huge unemployment? What will be the policy if the federal government or if the Federal Reserve is not entrusted to increase the supply of money in order to increase the aggregate output and to decrease or to decline the unemployment rate? So if the federal government is entrusted to adopt the fiscal policy, the question is what the government will do. Will the government increase its expenditures, or will the government increase the tax rate to decline the unemployment rate? What will be the policy? Here, actually, we are depicting the response of output and the interest rate to an expansionary fiscal policy. The expansionary fiscal policy refers to an increase in government spending or decrease in taxes. Look at point 1. Increase in government spending or decrease in taxes. This is known as expansionary fiscal policy. For example, an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes causes the LM curve, the IS curve to shift to I is 2 from I is 1. For example, if the federal government has increased its expenditures, so the I is curve will shift from I is 1 to I is 2, and the equilibrium point for both the goods market and the money market moves from point 1 to point 2. So from point 1 to point 2. Now the equilibrium point is at point 2, where we have I2 interest rate and Y2 level of aggregate output. The result in the change in fiscal policy is a rise in aggregate output to Y2 and a rise in the interest rate to I2 from I1 to I2 and from Y1 to Y2. Now look at the difference between the effect on the interest rate between an expansionary fiscal policy and an expansionary monetary policy. Look at the previous case. In the previous case, when the Federal Reserve increased the money supply, what was the result? A lower interest rate and a higher output level. But now, look at here. When the government increases its spending, what is the result? YAD has increased. I mean, there is an increase in the aggregate demand function. That's why the IS curve has shifted from the original position. What is the result? Level of aggregate output has increased from Y1 to Y2, and similarly, the interest rate has also increased from I1 to I2. But in the previous case, the output has increased, but the interest rate has decreased. But in this case, the output level has increased as well as the interest rate has also increased. It means that both the aggregate output and interest rate have increased when the government adopted an expansionary fiscal policy. So simply we can say that in the case of an expansionary fiscal policy, the interest rate rises, whereas in the case of an expansionary monetary policy, the interest rate falls. So in the case of an expansionary monetary policy, the interest rate decreases. But here, in the case of an expansionary fiscal policy, the interest rate has increased. So, an increase in government spending raises aggregate demand directly. What we can say about the relationship? Simply, we can say that the aggregate output and the interest rate are positively related to government spending and negatively related to taxes. Aggregate output and the interest rate are positively related to government spending. Look at when the government spending has increased, output has increased as well as interest rate has increased. That's why we can say that aggregate output and the interest rate are positively related to government spending when the federal government adopts the expansionary fiscal policy. But what about taxes? The relationship of these variables with the tax rate is found negative. It means that aggregate output and the interest rate are negatively related to taxes. Look at this is the summary. Factors that shape the IS and LM curves. You can see that we have five factors for the IS curve: consumer expenditures, investment expenditures, government expenditures, taxes, and net exports. These are the five factors that shift the IS curve. And the remaining two, money supply and money demand, these are the two factors that shift the LM curve. You can see the relationship from here, which you have discussed in the uh, first lecture, that how if there is a change in any factor out of these five factors, how these factors will change the position of the IS curve. The first three cases, I mean to say consumer expenditures, investment expenditures, and government expenditures, they have a direct effect on the interest rate and output. That's why the IS curve has changed from IS1 to IS2. But look at the case of tax rates. If there is an autonomous change in taxes, what is the response? Output will decrease and interest rate will decrease as well. It means that if taxes increases, consumption expenditures or consumer expenditures decreases. It means that the aggregate demand function shifts downward. YAD will decrease. What will be the result? The IS curve will shift to the left from the original position. And you can see here the IS curve has shifted to the left side, where we have a less level of aggregate output and the interest rate has decreased as well. That's why we can say that if there is an increase in tax rates, output and I both will decrease and the IS curve will shift to the left side. Now look at the last two factors, money supply and money demand. These are the two factors that shift the LM curves. If money supply increases, it means Y increases and I decreases. So the LM curve will shift to the right side. But what about the money demand? If the money demand increases, Y will decrease and I will increase. It means that when the money demand increases, interest rate will increase as well. So the LM curve will shift to the left side. You can see from here from LM1 to LM2. Output has decreased from Y1 to Y2, but the interest rate has increased from I1 to I2. It means that we are moving from point A to point B. So this was the conclusion of the whole discussion. Now we have an important point where we are discussing about the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy. In this topic, we will be talking about the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy, which I mean to say that which policy is more effective under circumstances. For example, how can policymakers decide which of these policies to use if faced with too much unemployment? For example, if the particular economy is experiencing a huge unemployment rate, suppose 10% or 20%, the question is which policy the policy makers should adopt? Which policy is more effective, the monetary policy or the fiscal policy? And important question is, should the policy makers decrease taxes or increase government expenditures or raise the money supply or do all three? which one is the best policy? Which policy tool the policy makers should adopt? Monetary policy versus fiscal policy. But now we are talking about the case of complete crowding out. When there is a crowding out situation, the question is which policy will be more effective? As you know that both monetary and fiscal policy affect the level of aggregate output. When monetary policy is more effective than fiscal policy, we will examine a special case of the Islm model in which money demand is unaffected by the interest rate. If the money demand is unaffected by the interest rate, we can say that money demand is interest inelastic. So the monetary policy affects output, but fiscal policy doesn't. If this is the case, I mean to say that if the money demand is interest inelastic, in this case, the monetary policy affects the aggregate output, but not the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy doesn't affect the level of aggregate output when the money demand is interest inelastic. The question is that how? Now we are talking about that how we can conclude this point. When the demand for money is unaffected by the interest rate, it means that when the money demand is interest inelastic, the Elim curve will be vertical. If this is the case, the Elim curve will be vertical. Look at here. This is the Elim curve. LM1 is vertical. Why LM curve is vertical? Because the money demand is interest inelastic. So in final A, an expansionary fiscal policy increases government spending. If the government adopts an expansionary fiscal policy, it means that if the government increases its expenditures or decreases taxes, so an expansionary fiscal policy means increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes, shift the IS curve from IS1 to IS2. If this is the case, if the government adopts an expansionary fiscal policy, I mean to say that if the government increases its spending or the government decreases the tax rate, what will happen? As you know that the IS curve will shift to the right hand side from IS1 to IS2 and leaves aggregate output unchanged. Look at the level of aggregate output. This is a fixed level of aggregate output. Why? Because we have the vertical LM curve. But now look at here. Look at panel B. If there is an increase in the money supply, what will be the result? As you know that when there is an increase in the money supply, the LM curve will shift from LM1 to LM2. It means that the LM curve will shift to the right side. It means that we are moving from point A to point B. And at point B, we have I2 level of interest rate and Y2 level of aggregate output. When the money supply has increased, the level of aggregate output has also increased because the money demand has increased. The LM curve shifts right. What is the result? Decrease in both interest rates and aggregate output level. Look at point 2, we have a decreased interest rate as well as an increased aggregate output. Therefore, monetary policy is effective, but fiscal policy is not. What is the conclusion? Let interest sensitive in MD, mean money demand. If the money demand is less sensitive, or if the money demand is interest inelastic, more effective is monetary policy relative to fiscal policy. Keep this point in mind. If we are having the case of less interest sensitivity in money demand, or in other words, if the money demand is interest inelastic. In that case, the monetary policy is more effective relative to fiscal policy. Look at here. In panel A, the output level remains the same and the interest rate has increased from I1 to I2 when we adopt an expansionary fiscal policy. But look at here, when we adopt an expansionary monetary policy, if the central bank of a country adopts an expansionary monetary policy, look at the result. The output has increased and the interest rate has decreased. And in panel A, the output remains the same. There is no change in the level of aggregate output by adopting an expansionary fiscal policy by the federal government. So we can conclude the analysis that if the demand for money is unaffected by changes in the interest rate, monetary policy is effective, but fiscal policy is not effective. Why? Because the less interest sensitive money demand is, the more effective monetary policy is relative to fiscal policy. And you know that this situation is known as crowding out. What do we mean by crowding out? As you saw in the previous two topics are in the last chapter, that expansionary fiscal policy always increase aggregate output. From the previous lecture and from the last lecture, you can conclude that the expansionary fiscal policy always increase the level of aggregate demand and has raised the level of aggregate output. But this situation doesn't occur here. Why? Because the Islm curve is vertical. The rightward shift in the I-S curve raises the interest rate to I2. Look at when the federal government adopts the expansionary fiscal policy, the I-S curve has increased. The I-S curve has shifted from IS1 to IS2, which causes investment spending and net exports to fall enough to offset completely the increased spending. Look at the interest rate has increased. It means that when the federal government adopts the expansionary fiscal policy and if the Islm curve is vertical. So in this case, we have extra amount of spending made by the government. But with the shift in the IS curve, we are having an increased level of interest rate. If there is a rise in the interest rate, it means the investment spending and net exports will fall. If the investment level and net exports fall, it means the fall in investment spending and net exports will offset the increased spending of the expansionary fiscal policy. Or we can say that increased spending that results from expansionary fiscal policy has crowded out investment. Because on one side, the government is increasing its spending. It means that the government has increased its spending, but the interest rate has increased. If the interest rate has increased, it means that the government, if the interest rate has increased, it means that the planned investment and net exports have declined. So we can say that the increase in government expenditures is offset by a decrease in both investment spending and net exports. This is known as crowding out. So the increase government spending has that result from expansionary fiscal policy has crowded out investment spending and net exports, which decrease because of the rise in the interest rate. Why the investment expenditure has decreased? Because of the rise in the interest rate. This situation in which expansionary fiscal policy doesn't lead to a rise in output is frequently known as the crowding out effect. Look at Y is constant. There is no change in the aggregate output level. On the one side, the government the federal government has increased the spending, due to which the IS curve has shifted from the original position to a new position, which is I is 2, and now the economy is at point 2, where we have apex aggregate output level and and a higher interest rate. If the interest rate is higher, it means the planned investment spending has decreased and the net exports will also decrease. As you know that there is a negative relationship between the interest rate and the planned investment expenditures, as well as there is an indirect relationship between the interest rate and net exports, which we have discussed in the previous chapter. That's why we can say that the increase in government spending has been offset by a decrease in both planned expenditures and net exports. So the output level doesn't change from the original position. This situation in which the expansionary fiscal policy doesn't lead to a rise in output is frequently known as the crowding out effect. So, in a conclusion, we can say that if the demand for money is unaffected by changes in the interest rate, monetary policy is effective, but fiscal policy is not effective. Or simply, we can say that the less interest sensitive money demand is, the more effective monetary policy is relative to fiscal policy. Islm model in the long run. As you know that so far in our Islm model, we have been assuming that the price level is fixed because now we are talking about the long run. In the short run, the price level is fixed. So we have been assuming that the price level is fixed so that nominal values and the real values are the same. As you know that when the price level is fixed, it means that there is no difference between the real quantity and a nominal quantity, or we can say that the nominal values and real values are the same if the price level is fixed. But this is a reasonable assumption for the short run. If we are analyzing the short run, if we are dealing with a short time period, this assumption is reasonable. But in the long run, the price level does change. It means that in the long run, the price level is not fixed. So, what will happen in the ISLM model in the long run if the price level is changed? So, what happens in the ISLM model in the long run? We make use of the concept of natural level of output. Look at this green vertical line yn. We are denoting this green line by the symbol yn. Actually, yn represents the natural level of output. Actually, this is the level of output at which the price level has no tendency to rise or fall. I mean to say that at yn level of aggregate output, the price level has no tendency to rise or fall. But when the economy is above the natural rate level of output, for example, look at point y2. Y2 is greater than yn, or we can say that the output level is above the natural rate level of output. If this is the case, so the booming economy will cause prices to rise. If y2 is greater than yn, it means that the given output level of an economy is higher than the natural level of output. If this is the case, so the booming economy will cause prices to rise. So price will rise. But when output is below the natural rate level of output, for example, if the economy is here, for example, if here we have y1, if the economy is here, it means that the actual level of output is below the natural level of output. So in this case, the slack in the economy will cause prices to rise. So simply we can say that if the economy level of output is above the natural level of output, the price will increase. And if the economy is producing below the natural level of output, the price will decrease. Now we want to examine what happens when the price level changes. What will be the result if the price level changes? Keep in mind that when the price level changes in the economy, we can no longer assume that the real quantity and nominal quantities are the same. If the price level changes, if the price level is not fixed, we can say that the real and nominal quantities are not constant. The spending variables that affect the IS curve describe the demand for goods and services and are in real terms. They describe the physical quantities of goods that people want to buy. Because these quantities do not change with the price level changes. A change in the price level has no effect on the IS curve, as if there is a change in the price level, it means that it will not affect the IS curve. Look at this figure. We have two figures. Panel A, which shows response to a rise in the money supply, and figure B is showing a response to a rise in government spending. In panel A, a rise in the money supply causes Islm curve to shift rightward to Islm 2. Look at here. For example, if there is a rise in the money supply, so with the rise in the money supply, the Islm curve will shift from Islm 1 to Islm 2, and the equilibrium moves to point 2. Originally, this is the original position. LM1 cuts the IS curve at point A, where we have I1 level of interest rate and YN natural rate of output. But when there is a rise in the money supply, a rise in the money supply MS, so the LM curve will shift from LM1 to LM2, and the equilibrium moves from point 1 to point 2. Now we are here where we are producing Y2 level of aggregate output and the interest rate is I2. Because output at Y2 because output at Y2 is above the natural rate level Yn. As you know that now Y2 is above Yn. The price level rises. As we discussed that if the economy is producing at Y2, which is above the natural rate of output, what will happen? Prices will rise. So in this case, the price level rises. If the price level rises, we can say that the real money supply falls. The real money supply falls because now prices are changing. If the price level rises, the real money supply falls and the LM curve shift back to LM1. What will happen? The LM curve will shift back. The new LM curve will shift back to the LM1. It means that the new LM curve will shift back to the original position, which is LM1. So we can say that the economy has returned to the original equilibrium position at point 1. What will happen? We will go back. We will move back from point 2 to point 1. Our LM2 will shift back to LM1. And now the economy is at the original position. Now look at panel B. Look at this panel. Suppose an increase in government spending shifts the IS curve to the right, because here we are talking about the expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy. It means that either a rise in government spending or a decrease in government taxes. Simply, if the federal government increases its expenditures, so what will happen? So an increase in government spending shifts the IS curve to the right from IS1 to IS2. If there is an increase or if there is a rise in government spending, what will happen? The IS curve will shift from IS1 to IS2 and the economy moves to point 2. Actually, initially we are here at point 1, but now we are here at point 2 where I2 is the interest rate and Y2 is the output level. But because output at Y2 is above the natural level of output, look at here, Y2 is greater than Yn. It means that the aggregate output is above the natural rate of output. The price level begins to rise because the economy is in a boom situation. When the economy is producing at Y2, what will happen? The price level will rise. And you know that if the price level rises, what will happen to the real money balances? Very simply, the real money balances begin to fall because real we can write the real money balance is equal to M over P. If P is increasing and M is constant, it means that real money balances decrease. So the price level, if the price level begins to rise, the real money balances begin to fall. And the Islm curve shift to the left to Islm2. What will happen? The Islm curve LM1 will shift to LM2. Now the long run equilibrium at point 2 dash. We will come here to this point 2 dash where I2 dash is the interest rate and the economy is now again at the natural rate level of output. The economy is producing again the natural level of output. But you know that here we have a higher interest rate than before and output has returned to Yn and the economy is producing at this point. So what we can conclude from the discussion? We can say the fact that increase in money supply has left output and interest rate unchanged in the long run. The increase in money supply has left output and interest rates unchanged in the long run is known as the long run monetary neutrality. Why? Because the increase in the money supply has left output and interest rates unchanged. The only result of this increase in the money supply is a higher price level. What is the result? The result of this increase in the money supply is a higher price level and has increased proportionally to the rise in the money supply so that real money balances are unchanged. And finally, real money balances are unchanged. So we have discovered in that even through complete crowding out doesn't occur in the short run in the ILM curve, but it does occur in the long run. Our conclusion from this examination that what happens in the ISLM model from an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy is that although monetary and fiscal policy can affect output in the short run, neither affects output in the long run because you know that in the long run these policies are not changing the aggregate level of output. So monetary policy and fiscal policy can affect output in the short run. As you have seen in the previous lecture, that both the monetary policy and fiscal policy affected the aggregate output level when we were dealing with the short run. But now, as you can see from the long run, the output level doesn't change, it remains fixed. So this was the analysis when the economy is in the long run and how the ISLM model will work if the economy is in the long run. And now finally, we are using the ISLM model to derive the aggregate demand curve. Now this is very simple that how we can derive the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model. The question is what happens in the ISLM model when the price level changes. When we conduct the Islm analysis with the changing price level, we find that as the price level falls, the level of aggregate output rises. Thus, we obtain a relationship between the price level and quantity of aggregate output, for which the goods market and the money market are in equilibrium, and this is known as the aggregate demand curve. Look at the Islm diagram in panel A. The Islm diagram in panel A shows that with a given nominal money supply, as the price level rises, suppose from P1 to P2 and then from P2 to P3. This is the IS curve and this is the LM curve when the price was P1. If the price increases from P1 to P2, the LM curve will shift from LM P1 to LM P2, and if the increase in price remains sustained, so the LM P2 will shift to LM P3. It means that from point 1 we will move to point 2 and then from point 2 to point 3. Look at here, a decrease in output level from Y1 to Y2 and then from Y2 to Y3. But look at the interest rates. The interest rates are increasing from I1 to I2 and then from I2 to I3. So we can analyze what happens in the Islm diagram when the price level changes. We have three price level. P1 is the original price level, P2 is the second, and P3 is the third price level. So this panel actually contains Islm diagram for a given value of nominal money supply. Now suppose we have the original price level at point P1. The LM curve at this point is LMP1. At P1 price, we have LMP1 curve, and this LMP1 intersects the IS curve at point 1, where we have I1 level of interest rate and Y1 level of aggregate output. Now, if the price level increases from P1 to P2, suppose if the price level increases from P1 to P2, then in real terms the money supply has fallen. Why the LM curve will shift back? Because the real quantity of money or the real money balance has decreased. That's why the curve will shift from LM P1 to LM P2. The effect on the LM curve is identical to a decline in the nominal money supply when the price level is fixed. The LM curve will shift leftward from LM P1 to LM P2. Now, the new equilibrium level of output is Y2. It means that the new equilibrium level of output has fallen from Y1 to Y2, but the interest rate rises from I1 to I2. Now we are here at point 2, and you can see these points, point 1 and point 2, and panel B. On the horizontal axis we have the aggregate output, and now on the vertical axis we have the price level, which is denoted by P. You can see point 1, point 2 here, point 1, point 1 and panel B, Y1 and P1. At point 2 we have Y2 and P2. Why? Because the price level has increased but the output level has decreased. It means that there is a negative relationship. Now, a further increase in the price level has occurred. Suppose now the price level has increased again from P2 to P3. From P2 to P3, what will happen? The LM curve will shift leftward from LM P2 to LM P3 because of a decline in real money balances. And this will lead to further increase in the interest rate and a further decline in planned investment and net exports. And hence, output declines. Look at when the price level has further increased from P2 to P3. It means that the real money supply has decreased. In a result, the interest rate has increased from I2 to I3, and we have moved from point 2 to point 3. So leading to a further increase in the interest rate and a further decline in plant investment and net export. What is the result? The output level has decreased from Y2 to Y3. And now look at this point 3 and panel B. This is the point 3 and panel B. If the price level is P3, now we have Y3 level of aggregate output. Now we are connecting these 3 points and panel B, point 1, point 2, and point 3 with each other. The line that connects the 3 points is the aggregate demand curve. This is the aggregate demand curve and it is denoted by AD. AD represents the aggregate demand curve. This aggregate demand curve indicates that the level of aggregate output consistent with equilibrium in the goods market and the market for money at given price level. But as you can see that the aggregate demand curve has sloped downward. The question is why its slope is downward. The aggregate demand curve has the downward slope because the price level reduces the money supply in real terms. The price level reduces the money supply in real terms, raises interest rates and lowers the equilibrium level of aggregate output. So that's why there is a negative relationship between the aggregate output and the price level. We have a negatively sloped downward slope for the aggregate demand curve. Now, what are the factors that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift? So very simply, there are two factors that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Number one, actually, when we are talking about shift in the aggregate demand curve, so the ISLM analysis demonstrated how the equilibrium level of aggregate output changes at a given price level. So keep in mind that a change in any factor that causes the IS curve or LM curve to shift causes the aggregate demand curve to shift. Five factors cause the IS curve to shift. In the previous lecture, we talked about that there are five major factors affecting the IS curve, the position of the IS curve. Number one, changes in autonomous consumer expenditures. Number second, changes in investment expenditures related to business confidence. Number third, changes in government spending. Number fourth, changing in tax rates. Number fourth, changes in autonomous net exports. These are five factors, and these five factors shifting the position of the IS curve. Now, suppose if the government adopts an expansionary fiscal policy, if the government adopts an expansionary fiscal policy, so the expansionary fiscal policy a rise in net exports are more optimistic consumers and firms shift the IS curve to the right. What will happen? The IS curve will shift from IS1 to IS2 because of the expansionary fiscal policy. But look at here at the price level of PA, because here the price level is fixed. So at the price level of PA, equilibrium output rises from YA to Y2. This change in the equilibrium output is shown a moment from point A to point B. And in panel A, hence the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right from AG1 to AG2. Very simply, suppose we have the initial aggregate demand curve AD1. This is the initial aggregate demand curve AD1. And suppose the federal government adopts an expansionary fiscal policy. I mean to say that if there is a rise in government spending, how a rise in government expanding will affect the aggregate demand. So look at panel B, that what happens to the equilibrium output holding the price level constant at PA. Suppose the price level is constant, the price level is fixed at PA. What will happen? Initially, the equilibrium output is at YA at the intersection of IS1, LM1, IS1, LM1, and the price level is fixed. We have the fixed price level. So IS1 touches LM1 at point A. The rise in government spending shift the IS curve to the right. The IS curve will shift from IS1 to IS2. Why? Because the government has increased its expenditures and raises the equilibrium output to YA dash, because when the ISLM model was in equilibrium position at point A, we have YA level of aggregate output and IA level of interest rate. But now the government has increased its expenditures. That's why the IS curve has shifted to the right side, and we have moved from point A to point A dash. Now the aggregate output is YA dash and the interest rate is IA dash. So now look at this change in panel A. This rise in equilibrium output is shown as a moment from point A to point A dash, and the aggregate demand curve shift to the right side from AD1 to AD2. What is the conclusion? Very simply, any factor that shifts the IS curve shifts the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. Let me repeat again. Any factor that shifts the IS curve. Here, why the IS curve has shifted its position? Because of the increase in government expenditures. So any factor that shifts the IS curve shifts the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. Look at here. Because of the increase in government expenditures, the IS curve has shifted its position from IS1 to IS2, and similarly, the AD1 curve has shifted its position to AD2. In other words, the IS curve has shifted to the right side, and similarly, the aggregate demand curve has also shifted to the right side. That's why we can say that any factor that shifts the IS curve shifts the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. Now look at the final case, shifts in the LM curve. Very simply, as you know that shifts in the LM curve are caused by either an autonomous change in money demand or a change in the money supply. There are actually two factors shifting the position of LM curve. Number one, autonomous change in money demand. Number second, a change in the money supply. So these are the two factors due to which the LM curve can change its original position. Look at this figure. Now in figure B, and panel B of the figure shows shift in the LM curve from LM1 to LM2, and we are interested to know its influence on the aggregate demand position, that how if there is a change occurs in the position of the LM curve, how this will influence the aggregate demand curve position. Suppose we are initially at point AD1. This is the initial aggregate demand curve. Suppose in panel A, we are here at aggregate demand 1, and we look at what happens to the level of aggregate level when the price level is held constant at PA. Suppose the price level is constant at PA. What will happen to the equilibrium level of output? For example, a rise in the money supply. If there is a rise in the money supply, what will happen? The LM curve will shift to the right, which will raise the equilibrium level of output. So now there is a rise in money supply. The LM curve has shifted its position from LM1 to LM2. You can see the change in aggregate output. Initially, when we were at point A, IA was the interest rate and YA was the aggregate level of output. But now the money supply has increased from LM1 to LM2. It means that the curve will shift, the LM curve will shift from LM1 to LM2, and now we have the new level of aggregate output YA dash, and we are here at point A dash. But what will happen? The aggregate demand curve will also shift to the right. So what is the conclusion? Very simply, holding the price level constant. I mean to say that PA is constant. If we keep hold this price level constant, any factor that shift the LM curve shift the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. I mean to say that if the price level remains the same, if the price level is kept constant, any factor that shift the LM curve, any factor that shifts the LM curve shifts the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. Look at here we have the fixed price level PA. The price level is fixed, and we have increased the money supply. With the increase in the money supply, the LM curve has shifted to the right. But look at the shift in the aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve has also shifted to the right side from AD1 to AD2. That's why we can say that if the price level remains the same, any factor that shifts the LM curve shifts the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. So these were the two important factors that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. So I think now you have a very clear idea that how we can judge the effectiveness of fiscal policy or monetary policy by using the ISLM framework, and how we can derive the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM framework, and what are the factors that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift its original position.